Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Friends of Chamber Music's vocal recital featuring soprano Sarah Shafer with her father Timothy Shafer at the piano. I'm Teresa Kuhn, here to offer you a few thoughts about their program. The Shafers have put together music from 4 different composers covering 200 years. They've organized it in chronological order to give our ears a chance to hear the development of music as it changed over these 200 years. The composers are Mozart, Hugo Wolf, Francis Poulenc, and Samuel Barber. Since Miss Shafer will be singing in 3 different languages, Friends of Chamber Music has created a PDF file for you with the translations and the poetry. It's on their website on the Sarah Shafer concert page, and I suggest that when I'm through talking and just before the concert begins, you print this document so that you can follow along. Not only will it help you understand the poetry, but it might help you also appreciate the nuances of the different composers' sounds through the 200 years as they interpreted poetry. We begin with Mozart. And of course, he was well known for his operas. In fact, he didn't write very many standalone vocal pieces for voice and keyboard. And the few that he did write aren't sung very often, so we're in for a treat today. The first one is Das Veilchen, the violet, with a text by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. And many of you may know that Goethe's writing often included aspects of nature, of science, and also philosophy. In this piece, he is likening a young boy's naive heart to a violet, and the violet is a symbol for the heart. In the storyline, we have a young, innocent shepherdess. She is skipping merrily along the path singing. She doesn't notice the little violet growing there, and she tramples on it, with the results that you can imagine for the poor young man's heart. The music is clear, clean, transparent, and balanced, as suits this classical period. The second piece is a bit of a contrast in that we have a young girl sitting at her spinning wheel. She's not naive. She doesn't trust young men. She thinks that they're going to spin around with her heart. So she's content to stay at home and not dally with young men yet. She's not ready for that. That music is somewhat folk-like, strophic, and again, pretty clear and straightforward. When we come to this third piece, the Mozart piece, we have a very operatic sound here. This was written in 1787 when Mozart was working on his famous opera Don Giovanni. And the character in the piece could well stand in for one of Don Giovanni's list of 1,002 women that he had seduced in his lifetime. The title of the poem is Als Luise die Briefe ihres ungetreuen Liebhabers verbrannte, which means as Louisa was burning the letters from her unfaithful lover. It was written by the German Sappho. Her name was Gabriele von Baumberg, and she wrote this poem when she was only 18 years old. I'll give you a taste of the fiery, dramatic, operatic music here. I think you can hear how that's going to tell our story in just a few pages, a very operatic scene. From there, we go to another piece that has an operatic connection. Many of you may be aware that Mozart's Magic Flute is based on the principles of the Masonic Brotherhood, to which Mozart was a member. He found a poem by Joachim Campe that has 2 of the strong Masonic ideals in it, and he wrote this next beautiful song for them. The 2 ideals are, the value of life comes from friendship, and the second, when life is coming to an end, we should accept this end gracefully. This piece is called Abendempfindung, Abend feelings or evening sentiments. The music is very flowing, very warm, comforting at times, but also foreboding. much like Mozart, but not as operatic as the previous piece. At this point, we move forward 100 years to the late Romantic period and the music of Hugo Wolf. Wolf was a strong follower of Richard Wagner. He loved dramatic music, unbridled emotion, and he scorned the tight adherence to structure and form that Brahms had been fond of. Wolf was a child prodigy on the piano and the violin. Apparently he had a very fiery temperament though, and the teachers found him uncooperative, so he was kicked out of most of the music schools where he studied. Nonetheless, he was very prolific, and he found some poetry by a Lutheran minister named Eduard Mörike. And in 1888, 100 years after Mozart, he set 53 of these poems, all in one season in the springtime. Even though he didn't know Mörike personally, this collection, the Mörike Lieder, are considered one of the strongest examples of how a composer can fully understand what a poet is trying to say. Ms. Shafer has chosen 5 pieces out of this set, and we begin with one called Der Knabe und das Imlein, the boy and the bee. And this piece, he wrote this on an afternoon, I think it was February 22nd. And when he wrote this piece, he ended up writing a second piece on the same afternoon. And even though Mörike didn't see these pieces as linked, Wolf did. And we're going to show you musically how he linked them. So, as I mentioned, he didn't like a lot of structure. So I'm going to play the beginning of this piece for you, the theme, and the way that in Mozart's time, the music might have automatically landed. It would sound like this. It's very clear, it's expectable, one chord leads to the next. Another option might have been a little bit sadder, but it still works, still makes sense to our ears. And one more option, brighter, still not too surprising. But this is what Wolf did. We've lost our footing. We feel unstable. We don't know where to turn next. And this was the way that Wolf interpreted this situation. The boy is talking to a bee. And the bee says, you know, the object of your desire is very young and innocent, kind of like our shepherd girl in Das Veilchen. She hasn't noticed you. You should give up on her. I'm going to bring her honey, and she's going to be content with that instead of your kisses. Well, Wolf thought that this, for the boy, was an unsettling thing to hear, and that's why he wrote the music the way he did. Later in the piece, you're going to hear some bee music. The bee buzzing around. It sounds like this. And also some trills. So when you hear those, you know that's the bee talking. Well, as I mentioned, Wolf took another poem of Mörike's, and he set it on the same afternoon. This one is called Ein Stündlein wohl vor Tag. And this one has a situation where a young lady is lying in her bedroom before daybreak, and she hears a swallow outside the window. And the swallow is telling her that she should not trust her current lover, that he is unfaithful to her, and that she should pull away from him. A little bit like the young spinner girl who didn't trust men and didn't want to give them her heart. Well, Wolf thought this was an unsettling, unstabling situation as well. So here's the music he used for her. It's exactly the same as the music he wrote for the boy and the bee. And what's more, he set up a kind of a circular motion in the introduction. I'll play it for you. And with this circular motion, which also occurs at the end of this piece, we have a feeling that we're always going to be returning to the boy and the bee, and it will never land. That's how he saw these two poems. On the other hand, as we move on, we have a glorious piece called ist, which means it's him. And you might think with a title like that this is a dashing young man who has arrived to steal away a girl's heart. But in fact, him refers to springtime. Der Frühling is a masculine noun in German. And in this case, spring is arriving in all its glory. And the music is jubilant, it is sensuous, it has a lot of joy in it. It sounds like this. And it continues like that as spring arrives. Great deal of joy throughout the whole piece, so it's a really nice contrast to the first two. After that, we visit with a mermaid. As you can tell, Mörike was very interested in humans talking with creatures from nature or creatures from fantasy. This is Nixe Binsefuss. This is a mermaid who is dancing out on the ice in the moonlight. I was asking myself what she was doing on top of the ice and how she could dance without any feet, but I don't think we're supposed to worry about that. She's dancing in the moonlight. And Wolf wrote some really wonderful kind of elfin ice dancing music. It sounds like this. And she's standing outside a fisherman's house and telling him, look, if you put any of my fish in your nets, you're going to be sorry. So it's lighthearted, it's delightful, and full of fantasy. This is followed by another piece to the springtime. And this piece is called Im Frühling, in the springtime. And in this case, we have a young man lying out on the grass. He's looking up at the sky. He can listen to the birds, he can hear the bees, and he has a feeling that his heart's desire, his beloved, is going to emerge out of the heart, out of the essence of springtime, and visit with him out here on this glorious day. The music is not as joyful or as jubilant as what you heard in Ist. This is more contemplative, and there's more of a sense of longing in it. And the longing starts to build with a figure that Wolf repeats over and over. I'll play some of it for you. Continues with changing harmonies, carrying our heart along with his longing. Very beautiful piece. And with that, we come to the end of this set of Mörike Lieder. From here, we go to 1939 and the music of Francis Poulenc, French composer, a member of Les Six, and this was a group who abhorred Richard Wagner. So they abhorred the very things that Hugo Wolf had loved. And Francis Poulenc wrote beautiful piano music, beautiful instrumental music, operas, and late in his life, a lot of sacred music. But earlier in his life, where we're visiting him now, he also wrote a lot of cabaret and theater music, and you're going to hear some of that influence in this set. The group of poems was written by his good friend Louise de Villemorin. It's called Fiançailles pour rire, betrothal for laughs or engagement for laughs. And you might think that, therefore, something for laughs, we're not supposed to take this poetry very seriously. It is absurdist poetry, and in that sense can be hard to understand. But it was written during World War II in Europe, and a lot of times absurdity was the only way that people could bear to look at the situation. What we'll be finding, though, is that Poulenc's interpretation of these lyrics adds a lot of depth and fills in a lot of our understanding. So this is an example where adding music might help make the poetry easier to understand and instead of less so. We begin with La Dame d'André, André's Lady. And in this piece, there's a question about whether a superficial betrothal or a premature betrothal, how that would affect a young lady. The music, though, is almost hymn-like and somewhat sacred. It sounds like this. reality of the questions being asked. This is followed by Dans l'herbe, in the grass. And I didn't mention that several of these poems refer to death, and this one is the first example of that. We have a young lady whose fiancé has died, and she's coming to the conclusion that there is nothing more she can do or say to him. And Poulenc found this to be an unsettling situation as well. So I'm going to give you an example that reminds us of the boy and the bee. Here's where the music might like to go, might lead us to go. In fact, what Poulenc does is this. Again, somewhat unsettling, pensive, asking some questions there. I will say that this piece does resolve, though, similar to the young lady's resolution that there is nothing more for her to do. From Dans l'herbe, we move on to Il vole. And this is a very delightful poem that's quite difficult to translate because it is based on a pun. The word voler in French means both to fly and also to steal. And in the poem we have a crow who of course knows how to fly, but crows are also famous for stealing. And so when you try to read the translation, sometimes the translator used the word steal and sometimes fly, but it's always the same motion. And Poulenc's music is very lively. Flight, not in some beautiful sonorous way, but flight in terms of escape. You can dart away, just like a thief would do. It's a delightful piece. This is followed by Mon cadavre est doux comme un gant. My corpse is sweet like a glove. And this image might seem gruesome or macabre to you. What we have is a woman who has died, and she's looking at her body and talking about it in a way that is very matter of fact. But Poulenc's music for this is very tender. And we end up with a feeling that this life, this body has lived a very rich life. There has been suffering, but also this body has treasured having life. Sounds like this. Expansive there. You might even be hearing a little bit of the jazz influence that interested Poulenc at that time. This piece is followed by Violon, violin, and this poem doesn't have a linear storyline. It's a little bit more like exploring the relationship between a violinist and her instrument. Poulenc's music here is a great example of the kind of thing he wrote for the cabaret and the theater. I'll give you a little taste. You're going to be hearing the voice sliding between pitches sometimes, and also a technique called parlando, which is where the voice is kind of talking on a pitch. You might think of it as Hamilton only 80 years later. This is really a really delightful piece. And it is followed by our final song in this set, Fleur, flowers. Here we have images of flowers, flowers at a funeral, flowers in winter, a heart that is burned, ashes. And again, even with these dark and sad images, Poulenc has brought a great deal of respect to them in what sounds to me somewhat like a processional. See what you think. And with that, we close our Poulenc section. And this brings us to one of my most favorite song cycles in the entire vocal repertoire, the Hermit Songs by Samuel Barber. Now, many of you may know Barber from his very famous Adagio for Strings, which, although it was written for instruments, was also transcribed for voice, so you might have heard a beautiful choral arrangement of it as well. Barber was actually a singer, and he wrote some wonderful operas and wonderful art songs for the voice. The poems in the Hermit Songs were found in a 12th century monastery in the journals that some of the monks kept, and they were translated into modern English by several different poets. And Samuel Barber has done just an absolutely masterful job of interpreting these texts with music sometimes very spare, sometimes very, very full. I would gladly spend another hour exploring these nuances musically with you. However, our time doesn't allow it right now. And I also don't want to give away some of the surprises in this little set. You might think that monks' journals would be all very solemn or very strict in some way, but there are juicy contrasts in this set. One that I want to point out to you is right in the middle of the set. It's called The Crucifixion. And the text explores the emotions that might have occurred to people watching a very public execution. And then later, the specific feelings that would come up in the mother watching her son be executed in this way. The music is spare and then sometimes very operatic, but haunting and also very intimate. I'll give you a taste. This piece is only 2 pages long, but I think it is an absolute masterpiece. I also want to point out a delightful song called The Monk and His Cat. And in this one, we're getting to meet a scholar monk who has a white cat in his little monk cell there, and they keep each other company. Well, a 12th century monk wouldn't have had a keyboard in his room. But since the poems were translated into modern English, I think that Barber decided to imagine that there might be a keyboard in the monk's room, and he provided some commentary by the cat. We'll see if you can pick it out. I think you get the idea. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy these Hermit Songs, and with them we come to the close of our program. Again, I encourage you to quickly print out the text so you can follow along, and sit back then and enjoy our program. Please stay tuned afterwards to enjoy a question and answer session with Friends of Chamber Music Executive Director Pat Zagalo and the artists. Again, I'm Teresa Kuhn. Enjoy the concert.